I don't often get much from the introductions at a top 10 list, so I'll get right to the point. Here are my top 10 films of 2024. Number 10. Biology grad student Rona returns home to the Scottish Orkney Islands to escape her life in London, where she had developed an addiction to alcohol. She spends her days with the forces that raised her: a hyper-religious mother, a father prone to manic episodes, and the vast expanse of the ocean. The Outrun understands recovery as a process of holistic self-acceptance, where the new sober self can't be freshly reborn, but must be understood in harmony with all that came before. Rona's experience with her parents, the beautiful Orkney Islands, and her years of intoxication cannot be easily tied up as good or bad, healing or damaging. Her parents were generally nurturing, while their capacity to be so also varied wildly throughout her childhood and continues to in the present. These Scottish islands, for all their beauty, are also boring, and she hungers for connections with people her own age. And even the years she spent drunk were also spent with a boyfriend who, for all we see in the film, was nothing but wonderful to her. Even the alcohol itself isn't simple. Rona voices matter-of-factly that she loved drinking. Intoxication, for all its destruction, is something people build a habit with because it works in some way. What's more, the journey toward gaining the serenity to accept the things Rona cannot change, the courage to change the things she can, and the wisdom to know the difference is communicated in subtext and metaphor. Rona narrates much of the film with facts about the Orkney Islands, both their real-life geology and their folklore. Showing, not telling, can be used as a quippy way to dismiss much film narration, but in this case, her explanations are showing us an academically inclined woman situating herself as a small part of a larger universe. It's the process of accepting smallness so you might keep the things you can't change from becoming insurmountable obstacles in your head. But the most powerful images from this movie are those of Saoirse Ronan staring out at the ocean, conducting it like an orchestra, paradoxically finding power amongst the things she can't control. It's a great movie about recovery that avoids many of the cliches of this kind of story. Number 9. Joshua Oppenheimer spent several years living amongst perpetrators of the 1965 Indonesian genocide for his documentary, The Act of Killing. He asked his subjects to produce their own dramatized account of the atrocities they took part in. It's a renowned film because it captures something rare in this world: what happens when those responsible for the worst actions of mankind start to see themselves clearly, and how they do or don't improve when their self-narratives fall apart. To follow an exclusively documentary career with a melodramatic musical seems absurd, but it's remarkable how naturally the end follows from Oppenheimer's previous work. It is, again, about how persistent human beings can be in justifying the unjustifiable. The film follows a wealthy family who have survived an unspecified climate catastrophe at the bottom of an abandoned salt mine. Their bunker resembles the most opulent mansion. The walls are covered with the old world's most famous works of art. The central couple, hinted to have played some role in the world's destruction, have raised their son underground on the best literature and most flowery narratives from our history. When everyone breaks out in song, the numbers feel almost ripped from a Disney movie, but only almost. They are so subtly undercut by a vacant stare, awkward pause, cracked voice, or a long echo through empty white caverns. Something is off. We cannot be taken in by the music like the cast can. Not while watching the inflation of their home's sole source of oxygen act out the last gasps of humanity. Not in this cavern covered in seasoning with little nourishment. And the ensemble is made to join us in this discomfort when they are viewed through the eyes of an outsider stumbling out of the wasteland into their pseudo-paradise. I worry about spoiling this movie a bit and denying it to make its own case, but I think so many people will avoid it because of bad reviews or because it's a musical. So let me lightly assuage those fears by saying that I specifically love this movie because I have a natural cringe reaction to musicals, and I think this movie is made for people like me and leverages that cringe to tremendous effect. Perhaps, objectively speaking, it's a bit too long, but screw objectivity. Art is an experience that intertwines with our emotions to make us feel and think about new things, and this was a piece of film I fell the most in love with this year. This is my list, and statistically, if you're still here after 5 minutes, you're probably gonna watch the rest of it. I'm not locked in here with you, you're locked in here with me. Anyway, here's number 8. The most fun I had with the movie last year was Hundreds of Beavers. It simultaneously plays with the tropes of silent movies, old cartoons, and video games without taking a single shot or gag for granted. It's 109 minutes of escalating absurdity that somehow doesn't ever lose its novelty. That this was made for less than the price of most houses is astonishing. It even leverages its low budget into one more dimension of humor. We follow Gene Kayak, a cider salesman who, after a particularly long bender, passed out for the winter and woke up with a Rip Van Winkle beard and icicles coming out of his ears. He then embarks on a journey to catch various woodland critters for sustenance. Each animal looks like a high school mascot and turns into a ragdoll when they die that our hero can then bring to a shop to exchange for items to then kill more of those animals. Again, it's a video game movie, not in any existing property, but the narrative mechanics work like a video game. The humor is less completely novel as the film goes along, but it still gets funnier and funnier as each joke builds upon something that was there before. There's a lot of heavy, long, or slow movies on this list, and this is probably the easiest watch for anyone who wants to just have a good time. It's free a lot of places with ads, though it also deserves your money if you want to spend a little extra to avoid that. Number 7. There were times I feared that queer was becoming unbearably on the nose. A scene would illustrate something too well, but then we'd linger with a shot so long that it transformed from blunt and exact to alive. You feel every often painful second like a needle slowly plunging deeper and deeper into your skin. It's a patience that makes this both a devastating exploration of longing and a fascinating companion piece to Guadagnino's much faster challengers, which probably deserves a space on this list, but it felt wrong to feature the same director twice. Queer follows Lee Anderson, a middle-aged gay man in Mexico City in the 1950s whose person roughly resembles William Burroughs, whose novel the film is based upon. We see Daniel Craig's Lee fall deeply in love with a much younger man, Eugene, played by Drew Starkey. Eugene entertains Lee's advances while clearly not reciprocating his complete passion. One receives an outpouring of affection while the other gets to convince themselves it will one day become more. I love Daniel Craig because he could have played the same James Bond-esque dashing gentleman for his whole career, but instead he's chosen characters that are both distinct from that and often very silly. As serious as this film is, Lee is tragically silly, the kind of silly we are trying to impress someone whose affection we hunger for, who even when we know we are deluding ourselves, that irrational hope is still an opiate for our deepest pains. Drew Starkey also really gets who Eugene is, someone exploring themselves while benefiting from the affection of a wealthy writer. He's both not in love and even looks down on Lee. Starkey's performance I've seen mistaken for a blank slate. I found it rather to be a believable portrayal of the wall one builds around themselves when they're discomforted by someone overstepping their boundaries. And that twinge of resentment that his relationship with Lee isn't actually entirely bad. It's not a movie that can be neatly processed, and I fear that's lost it some attention. If you're someone who has enjoyed Guadagnino's larger movies, I'd recommend checking this one out. Number 6. My relationship to predictability in movies has evolved a bit over the years. I've grown to accept that not every story beat needs to surprise me for its impact to be meaningful. However, A Different Man is both narratively and thematically unpredictable, with each plot twist redefining what the film is trying to quote-unquote say. Sebastian Stan's Edward undergoes transformative facial surgery under the assumption that all his problems stem from a facial disfigurement. It's a film that defies neat narratives, those around disability that frame such either as an obstacle to be overcome or an identity bestowing moral superiority, rather than a singular feature of complicated human beings. Similarly, the film is very aware of the narrative tropes and filmmaking conventions it follows. 16mm filming makes this more sci-fi concept feel of our reality by evoking traditions of filmmaking concerned with slice of New York City life. But then we have a large chunk of the plot involving a play put on by Edward's love interest, in concert with developing uses of color that could be more out of an Almodovar film in a more heightened reality. Makes the whole thing seem as though it's hammering this mosaic of cracks onto the fourth wall without ever fully shattering it. And along with that, my god, this movie is hilarious. So much comedy is built upon the subversion of expectations, so I guess it makes sense that this was the movie that I laughed the most at in a theater last year. It is my pick for the funniest movie of the year, even if the darkness of the humor loses it the most fun title to Beavers. I appreciate that this is sometimes an unsettling movie, however, rather than one made to make me feel comfortable. There's this thing queer film critic Alonso Duralde said now more than a decade ago about The Imitation Game that plays in my head a lot.
It is designed to make modern liberals feel like if they had been living back then, they'd have been one of the nice people and not one of the mean people. That kind of discrimination is so endemic to society and ingrained and institutionalized that it wasn't just the mean people, like it was everybody.
Unfortunately, unpleasant feelings are not as marketable, and I wonder whether this is why A24 both did not do a lot to promote A Different Man or get it into that many theaters. It's a real shame because it's a brilliant piece of filmmaking you should definitely check out on Max. Nickel Boys is the second film on this list from a previously documentary filmmaker, and I want to clarify that I didn't consider documentaries for this list, not out of some ideological reason. I just needed to somehow pare down the movies I watched, but seeing how documentary filmmakers are pushing the medium forward makes me regret my decision a little bit. In a narrative film, we don't often conceive of the camera, but in a documentary, we're more aware of it because someone had to be in that space to capture what's going on. Nickel Boys fosters a similar awareness, with most of the film taking place from the first-person perspective. And further, a lot of the movie is an interplay between two characters that collectively recreate the perception of a classical shot-reverse shot, articulating how living life in tandem with a person who understands us builds our perception of our world. Nickel Boys follows two teenagers in reform school in the mid-1960s. They are both subjected to merciless corporal punishment, neglect, and segregation from their white counterparts. Rather than place these injustices squarely in the past, both the recency of the real school the film is based on and the concurrence of the film's events with civil rights advances that, should you ask some, permanently ended racism in this country, Nickel Boys forces engagement with white supremacy as continuous and experienced by living, breathing human beings. While it obviously engages with larger societal arguments, it is about, people, children. The inner emotional lives of both Elwood and Turner are so thoroughly realized. Beyond acting by Ethan Harisi and Brandon Wilson, the camera work develops their point of view. Every shot seems like a memory and informs us of what characters are seeing, often escaping into the small when the big fails them. Light from a window moving up a wall, the texture of icing on a cake, pencils sticking out of particle boards, or a ladybug crawling across the rim of some glasses. This is a beautiful movie. It's not the first one shot in the first-person perspective, but a lot of what Nickel Boys does with it is new and pushes the medium forward. I realize also that a lot of the titles on this list are topical, and I think to an extent this is because expressing things that are not necessarily within every person's comprehension requires pushing a visual medium to new places and makes for works that are in totality more interesting than those that don't attempt to do that. Number 4. At time of writing, the minimum wage in America is $7.25. In India, this translates to 624 rupees, higher than most of the country's daily minimum wages. Income is also higher in cities than in rural areas, incentivizing migration towards urban centers. Collectively, this forms an undertow, sweeping families across a country and around the world in search of a livable salary. Concurrently, in the city of Mumbai, citizens speak dozens of languages and practice numerous different religions. Just as economic forces forces separate people, these differences form a wall of communications between those living in sometimes physically close proximity. And expectations around relationships and gender form yet another invisible force. Any film trying to explore all these things at once should buckle under the pressure, but All We Imagine Is Light manages to do it all without ever turning into the camera and telling you what it believes. We follow two nurses who work and live together in Mumbai. Though their generational gap means they engage with societal expectations differently, they are bonded by both having left the state they grew up in, a common language, and numerous attempts to better understand themselves and each other. When Prabha, the older of the two women, snaps at Anu for attracting the ire of their coworkers, we understand that rather than a barb meant to drive them apart, it is ultimately a panicked act of protection. It's a story of intergenerational bonding as powerful as any other, made by two fantastic performances from Kani Kuzruti and Divya Prabha. And again, a beautiful movie. The trains intersecting the background of so many shots reiterate the forces pulling people from one place to another. The cityscapes that reduce humans to moire flickers evoke both a sense of smallness in the universe and light unconstrained by the demands of an imperfect world. It's so effective with its imagery that eventually a kitchen appliance becomes the centerpiece of one of the most powerful scenes of the year. And I realized this. Also, director Payal Kapadia has done a lot of documentary work as well, so we're continuing that trend. I think my enjoyment was also bolstered by seeing this while visiting family in New York City and walking out of the theater into a deluge of pedestrians, car horns, and streetlights, to walk out into so much activity of other human beings around me. But sitting down to write my thoughts about it, I'm pretty sure it would have made this list regardless. I also spoke with a friend who speaks Malayalam, the language spoken by both main characters in All We Imagine Is Light, and they pointed out that Prabha means light in Malayalam, a detail which the film's English subtitles never make a point to explain, and would lend a lot of meaning because she's pretty much the main character. It was a humbling thing to hear as someone who watches a lot of movies in languages I don't speak. Something is always lost in translation. Number 3. In Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, evolutionary biologist Robert Sapolsky explains that human beings are saddled with emotions originally designed for a more dangerous world. Now we deal with a constant string of small stressors that nonetheless trigger reactions originally developed to keep us out of reach of lion's claws. One interested in a utopian vision of humanity might be curious what we would look like if we were free of those trauma responses hard-coded into our DNA. Whether possible or not, it's a fascinating question to ponder, and one that's so devastatingly explored in The Beast. In 2044, following a series of human-caused catastrophes, much of society is run by AI, and most humans have little to do. Our protagonist, Gabrielle, played by Lea Seydoux, works checking the temperatures of computer servers. She decides to undergo a procedure to remove those old, trauma-caused instincts from her DNA, and in the process, relives some past lives that played a part in fostering those instincts. She discovers a series of past encounters with a man played by George McKay, who is in the present day considering the same procedure as her. What follows is an examination of love and emotion that both refuses to romanticize the past and acknowledges the absolute despair of our current reality. Making timely art is hard, capturing a moment without over-reliance on references that will not land years down the line. Yet, the sci-fi narrative of The Beast walks that tightrope by making sure that when it plays on archetypes and pop culture references, the characters wearing them on skin level are complexly understood beneath that. If you haven't gathered, this is a more abstract story than hard sci-fi. I use the term past lives rather than ancestors, as I don't think that it even makes story sense that these are either character's real blood relatives. I have to admit, I watched this trying to find a reason not to put it on here. I have this self-consciousness about having the pretentious label thrown at me, and I couldn't just go and put the most French movie on earth high up on my list. But I did love it. It's bonkers. There's this bit from a podcast I listened to that I think sums it up really well.
And there's this scene where like Lea Seydoux is like floating naked in a tub of black goo, and a robot is like, you need to go to a nightclub and it's going to be the year 1982. And a guy walked out. I'm like, what are you doing? Where are you going? What possible better thing do you have to do right now than see where this is going?
Number 2. made a video back in early December committing myself to this top 10 list. As part of it, I had a little scroll through my favorite films from each year of the past decade. I was having some trouble figuring out what my top film from 2015 would have been, so I looked at an old top 10 list I made back then and scrolled through it till I found one I still stood behind and moved on.
Problem is, I'd forgotten that Mad Max Fury Road didn't even make my top 20 back then.
I need to really remedy my past failure by saying that Furiosa is in the top tier of movies from last year. When someone says something about a modern blockbuster to the effect of, "Oh, it's an action movie, what were you expecting?" I'm expecting this. A film with a story that's heartbreaking and layered next to action scenes that are the absolute best I've seen in maybe 20 years. We can have franchise movies with complicated characters where every single frame would look good hanging on your wall. Large movies are getting worse, converging on market-tested appeal that fills seats but leaves most people disappointed walking out of the theater. Furiosa demonstrates that we can have great, large movies without compromise. We follow Furiosa from her abduction described in Fury Road to the expert wasteland warrior we meet in that film. It's an odyssey with the scale of multiple decades and leagues of open desert, but the most profound impact comes from the character formed by that experience. Every step of revenge against the people who took a comfortable life away from her is also one turning her into a machine built for nothing else. It's a character study perfectly portrayed by Anya Taylor-Joy and Elila Brown that can be self-contained while also deepening the significance of Charlize Theron's performance. In the near decade between films, the action has only gotten better, even if it makes up less of the film than its predecessor. The rhythm is percussive, pulsating through your bones. It understands that continuity of action is more impactful than scale. You focus on the juggling act of key points rather than overwhelming CGI spectacle. If you haven't had the best sequence from this film spoiled yet, it's 12 minutes of perfection. You need to watch this. I saw it twice in theaters, a practice I'm gonna try and step back from as to not get tired of movies, but I also did it with my number one movie on the list. But before that, I noticed personally, I click off top 10 lists midway through an explanation of number one sometimes because the suspense is gone. I'm not proud of that, but in an attempt to assuage that in this list, I'm gonna give a short bit on my numbers 11 through 20 after I finish up with number one, so stay tuned for that if you're interested. Number one. In recent years, I have been unable to resist naming my favorite film of the year as the one that made me cry the most. Tears have come a lot easier to me as I've gotten older and have more experiences to relate stories to, but that doesn't mean it's any less special when a movie manages to make me bawl. Films are a form of human expression. It feels good to me to free myself of clinically determining the movie that is quote-unquote objectively the best, to name the one that spoke to me specifically. And as I predicted when I first saw it back in May, that movie was I Saw the TV Glow. Accepting yourself is such a challenge. Self-hatred can envelop your perception of yourself to a point where even what brings you the most joy decays into an embarrassment or inconvenience to other people. This film reached something deep with a lot of trans people, acknowledging an identity in a society full of hatred for it. It's impossible not to internalize to some extent. Part of the reason I've tried to find a balance of acknowledging the political dimension of all these films without defining them by it is because as a non-binary person, I find any analysis of this film that doesn't at least touch on gender identity to be to some extent incomplete, while also being surprised that this film hasn't had a broader appeal. A lot of us learn to silence some passions we haven't acknowledged since childhood. We give up on dreams based on what strikes us as realistic, and if this coincides with self-hatred, we value other people's perspective of what we should be over our own. The way this film makes reference to 90s TV is such a great metaphor for dormant desires and pains like that. A small inkling of unacknowledged inner light. The bits of brightness peeking out make this film for me. The small tender moments are heartbreaking because of all the detached monotone interactions they're surrounded by. The muted colors of the trans pride flag highlighting the film's small moments of joy are both meager and beautiful, like its protagonists struggling to be anything but what other people want them to be. It's not as on the face daringly experimental as something like Nickel Boys or The Beast, but it's doing something risky because when it doesn't work for someone, it's 100 minutes watching adult teenagers mumble over raspy indie music. I think it made the small moments of emotion devastating. The risk paid off for me, and risk really was what I was looking for in movies because I found that's where the works that I've loved the most in my life have made me feel less alone. I saw that TV Glow genuinely changed my life more than anything else here. It made me acknowledge that writing about film and storytelling in general is always what made me the most passionate, but I've never seriously tried to do it. It motivated me to start committing myself to make something every week that I take the time to share with the world. And doing so brought me more happiness than any antidepressant, dietary change, or exercise regimen has in my adult life. Maybe it'll never become more than a hobby, but the few hours I spend each week on this channel are a real treasure to me. I'm sharing this vulnerability here because I think this video has, up to this point, shown a lot of myself in my art house taste and politics that I think should have given a good sense to anyone watching of whether I'm someone they want to keep listening to. My goal in making these is that the hours I put into them are less than the hours people spend watching them, and it's a goal I've consistently met, and that makes me really happy. So let's fill in the top 20. Number 11 is Close Your Eyes. I was an hour into this when I realized I'd gotten a complete arc that I'd loved and had no idea what it was going to do with its remaining 2 hours of runtime. And it just kept me in that place of complete satisfaction with what I had that was only improved by what came after. Number 12 is Janet Planet, a great movie about reckoning with both the imperfection of how one is parented and how one parents. I made a short video on a scene I really liked if you want some more thoughts on that. Number 13 is The Room Next Door. It told an appropriately even kitschy story about learning to accept death as another beautiful fixture of the life we live. 14, Do Not Expect Too Much from the End of the World, the least pleasant movie I saw last year. I used to have this opinion that films should always be able to convey negative experiences without making their audience bored or having their attention challenged at all, and now I wholeheartedly disagree. This movie is appropriately grating for how it portrays the gig economy. 15, Red Rooms, the coldest movie I saw this year. I've seen some Hanukkah-inspired movies that annoy me a little bit because I feel like they're stylistically like his films without much to convince me they had to be like that. But Red Rooms is one that completely fits his kind of style of cold detachment. What are we at now? 16, Inside the Yellow Cocoon. I found this to be very much an editor's movie. The main character is an editor, and a lot of it is in long takes without any cuts, so kind of stripping that editing power away. There's a scene like 20 minutes in that completely perverts the perspective of the audience. It's a thing I've never seen before. I know it's a hard sell at its length, but I'd really encourage watching it for anyone with some sort of relationship to video editing. 17, The Brutalist is great. I had some misgivings immediately afterwards that I now think were completely wrong. Every bit as good and worth seeing in 70mm as people say. 18, I loved Baby Girl. Alonso Duralde described it as a kink coming out story, which I think works with my assertion that it's a sweet movie rather than a thrilling one. Harrison Dixon is doing amazing work for Gentle Giants. 19, Honora. I think so many other people gave Honora a lot of love, and that made me less inclined to find room for it, but I'll probably regret having it so low. I'm not 100% sure whether all the tonal shifts work, but that might actually be its greatest strength. And finally, the one that maybe comes closer to a guilty pleasure, but I just couldn't leave it off the list because of how much I've listened to the music of the group it's based on. Number 20 would be Kneecap. Just an incredibly fun film. So there you have it, 20 great films from last year, or I guess 21 if you consider the fact that I sort of inserted Challengers in the same slot as Queer. You can find a complete ranking of all 57 movies I've thus far seen from last year on my Letterboxd. It's gonna be really loose. I'm not gonna edit it any further. I'm far more interested in the why that a movie connected with me than the what. I'm not gonna argue with anyone about their particular placement. I also made a video on 10 different horror movies from last year, some of which were really good, and it's not a judgment on them that they didn't make this really competitive list. And if you've made it this far, I release a 5 to 10 minute video about film every Friday, so consider subscribing. Again, thank you so much. Most people really don't keep watching this far. Hope you have a great February.